Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Indy Real Estate Investing Podcast. I'm your host, Jeremy Tallman, and with me today is my business partner, Scott Hallberg. Welcome back to the show, Scott.
Hi, thanks. Great to be back. It's been a little bit.
Yeah, so how's your fall going?
It's been great. I mean, we've had the most amazing weather in Indiana.
We have.
I know you took a little trip to Tennessee, but it was nice down there as well, obviously. But we had great fall weather, above normal temperatures, and I've been soaking up the sun, trying to stay outside as much as I can. I've been doing a lot of bicycle riding, and unfortunately last weekend fall hit with a vengeance, and now it's fall.
It is fall. I mean, it was kind of chilling out there. I'm just notorious. I don't wear a coat till like there's like frost and snow and stuff, and I should have worn a coat today because it's chilly out there. But
yeah,
I don't know if our listeners know, but you're like a serious cyclist. Like, you know, we both went to IU. You were part of a little 5 team that won, which is a kind of a neat story. And so you've kind of stayed with it all these years later.
Yeah, I've been riding bicycles, and I raced for a long, long time. I haven't raced in a couple of years. As I've gotten older, it's a little tougher. But yeah, about 45 years I've been a cyclist.
Wow, that's impressive. Yeah, it's a hobby that I'd say you stuck with it. So. All right. So, well, Scott, just under a year ago, we experienced an event that I brought you on here to talk about. And we had a fire at one of our rental properties that you and I actually own. We've owned it, I think, for about 15 years. It's one of my favorite rental properties. I don't know about you, but I've always loved this home. It's a property. It's a quad in an historic area, and I've just loved it. But it was a pretty bad one. And we have, just in what we do, as many homes as we manage, we've had a whole lot of fires that we've dealt with over these 2+ decades of doing this. Some have been bad. Most of them have not been bad at all. We've never had a fatality, which I think is great, because a lot of management companies can't say that. You know, you do this long enough and that can happen. But so talk about, like, in the whole scheme of things, property management is full of problems. It can be full of disasters at any given day, but where do you rank fires in the whole hierarchy of PM disasters, I guess?
Yeah, that's a tough question. You know, I think overall, as you mentioned, there are a lot of things that could go wrong, but from a property destruction standpoint, it's definitely in the top 5.
Mm-hmm.
Besides natural disaster, which, you know, we do have that exposure here a little bit we're kind of in the fringe of Tornado Alley, but other parts of the country have other exposures with flood or other things, obviously. But fire has to be up there, and it is kind of a fear of mine. I mean, I think, knock on wood, we've never had a serious injury or anyone be injured in a fire we've had, but we've had several, and it seems like we've had a little bit of a uptick in minor fires. So yeah, this is a relevant time. I think October, November is sort of like fire safety months, and kind of talk about that. I think it's a relevant topic to kind of bring it full circle to what happened to us, and then what maybe landlords can do to help minimize the risk.
Yeah, you know, it is, because this time of year, people are firing furnaces up for the first time. Maybe they're using appliances like a stove incorrectly just to get heat in for whatever reason. But yeah, I think this is the time where we see an uptick in fire. So before we get into this specific fire, I want to take you back maybe like, I think 20 years or so ago, and talk about the first fire that you and I went through as landlords. And it was a single family home on 46th Street. What do you remember about that fire?
Yeah, I mean, it was a while back. You know, we didn't have anything like this happen for a few years, so we kind of were just skating along and not have anything serious like this. But yeah, that one night we got the call, and you know, it's sort of fuzzy, but I think, you know, it was a shock. I mean, it was kind of like our house. What happened to it, you know?
Yeah.
And then, you know, our first questions obviously were, what about the occupants? Was everything okay? And then we learned that it was. And I think that, you know, once we found out the cause of it, it was a little surprising. And then it kind of took a weird turn with that. But, you know, I guess it ended up being a child playing with matches in a bedroom.
Yeah.
And
classic way to start a fire.
I guess, lit the closet on fire, and it kind of spread up through the attic and roof. Luckily, it didn't do a tremendous amount of damage in the whole scope of things. I mean, there was significant water damage through the house. I mean, I remember, surprisingly, it's the first time I've seen this happen, firsthand, is that, the fire department just comes and cuts holes in the
They don't
roof.
mess around. Yeah.
And next thing you know, it's like your roof is like a Swiss cheese, and
Yeah.
they pour water down through it, and everything gets flooded out. So, but luckily, the fire itself didn't like structurally damage too much, and it was a pretty painless turnaround. I mean, at the end of the day, what the surprising twist of this is our insurance company went after the resident.
They did.
For liability, and
They did.
she was,
Yeah.
the adult in the situation versus the minor. And I think they had a judgment against her. I don't know whatever happened with that, but we were made whole. Yeah. So
yeah, the occupant, the resident, had to leave, and I don't know. I mean, I think I made this call. It was probably not a smart decision in hindsight, but we put her in another property of ours, if you remember. Like, we just said, oh well, we have this one. It was on Ruckle Street, not far away, and she moved in there, and that's kind of how we stayed in touch with her. And then I remember her talking to her one day, and she's like, I just got sued by your insurance company. I'm like, oh yeah, I guess that makes sense, because you're the one that caused the fire. So
we had nothing to do with it. I mean, obviously,
right.
we were surprised, but
yeah, and that was before really renters insurance, which I'm sure we'll talk about, was really a big thing. And so we didn't enforce that, didn't probably know much about it back then. But so yeah, that was our first one. Again, like you mentioned, not terrible. But we did go through one, not a property that we own, but property that we managed several years ago. Probably the worst one we've had. You want to talk about those details a little bit and what you remember about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's another one of these, late evening phone calls you get, and we learned that there was a house fire. At first, I was like, okay, another house fire. But then we finally got some of the details, and it basically burnt the house down to the ground.
It did.
It was a total loss, and that was a little bit of a shock. But yeah, fortunately, again, our first thoughts were the residents, and I think that this occupant was a veterinarian, and she had
something
dogs
like that
she took care of, and luckily she got out and got the dogs out, and everything was fine. That was a big relief. But yeah, we had to like fence off the property and tarp it, and basically it was a tear down and rebuild ultimately.
Yeah, that's what it was.
I think it took over a year, and of course we terminated with that client, I think, while he was rebuilding, and I bet he just sold it once he rebuilt the house. I don't know. I can't remember.
I think that's right. And I believe, if I remember correctly, the reason for this fire was a flue was not insulated correctly, and it got into the attic. Is that right? Is that how you remember it?
There was an ember that escaped the flue liner and combusted something. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and again, I kind of remember, because I was over leasing at that point, and we were able to place her into another property like that same day, another managed property, because she was a great tenant, and we wanted to keep her, and she wanted to stay with us, so we were able to do that. But again, that was, again, a total loss, big time fire, and a whole lot to deal with there. So, all right, well, I thought it'd be interesting to go down memory lane a little bit and talk about, a couple different fires we've dealt with. Scott, we have what we call an adverse event board here. And when we have big, bad things that happen with our company, whether it's an eviction or an illegal move-in or whatever, they go onto a board. I was looking earlier, we actually have 2 kitchen fires on that board right now. So It's just a reality of what we do. Fires happen a lot, unfortunately.
Yeah, I did some research, and, I've heard this before, but I wasn't quite sure of it. There's a house fire like every 90 seconds in America.
Wow.
And so it is a real thing. There's over 350,000 a year. So if you're in real estate and you have, decent quantity of homes that you're dealing with, you're going to have some statistically. And as I mentioned earlier, we are experiencing a little bit of an uptick, and we have 2 kitchen fires that we're dealing with right now that turned out to be pretty minor. I mean, in the whole scope of things, but it still is a process and a problem that we have to go through. And I'm sure no one enjoys these things, and obviously our owners are suffering from this, but at the end of the day, we're here to try to get them through that. And I think we have some good processes with the adverse event board and the insurances that we have now, and our residence insurance that we require that helps protect that for our owners.
Yeah. All right. So let's get into the fire that we led the show with. What do you remember about that night? Because it was just about a year ago when all this happened. So kind of talk me through, what you remember about it.
Yeah, it was a, really nice night. It was windy and warm. I remember that. And, I think I was out in the early evening and came home and I got that dreaded phone call from your property manager. In this case, it was our maintenance manager. Our maintenance department handles our after hour calls. And I kind of clinch up when I get those
Yeah.
calls because I know it's usually not good news. And this time it was one of our properties. And, the first words is like, you had a house fire. And I was just like, oh, okay. And when he said which one it was, as you mentioned earlier, how nice this property was, is one of our favorite ones. It was heartbreaking to know that this historical home was damaged. And at that point, we didn't know how bad it was, but we did hear that the fire department, they kicked everyone out, and we knew that the home wasn't inhabitable. So I think we made our plans, and I think you visited the property the first thing the next morning to kind of get your eyes on it, and you sent me some pictures, and it was a little shocking to see. I mean, obviously, on some level, it could have been so much worse, but it did cause a lot of damage, surprisingly.
Yeah, I got a text from you a little after 9 o'clock, which sometimes I'm asleep. Full disclosure, I go to bed early, but it was October 28th was actually the date I wrote it down, and you indicated we had a fire at our quad and thought it started outside. I can't remember, that was the kind of the context of the text. We didn't know really what happened, and so on the next morning, I don't live too far away from the property. On my way into work, I stopped by and started visiting the property, and it occurred outside on a deck where, again, another stereotypical reason is that there was a cigarette, I believe, thrown out into a potted plant, and this person thought the cigarette was extinguished. They left the property, and then the fire starts on the deck. So that property, it was an upstairs unit. I walked into it, and it was burned out. Like the kitchen work that was nearest the deck, and just the amount of water. The property was still like raining. It was dripping. When I walked through it, because like you mentioned, fire department, their first thing is let's get it out. They don't care about what's inside as long as the people are out. They just want to get the fire contained, and the amount of water that went into that property it's hard to imagine. But I remember thinking, Scott, like I took some pictures and we got a contract that does a lot of insurance jobs for us. And I remember talking to him and I said, I think this is probably $100,000 deal. But like a lot of times we drastically underestimate the cost of what it takes to get things fixed, and in this case restored. So can you talk about, because you kind of took the lead in working with the insurance company and heading the contractors up, but talk about what the damages ended up being, and then what our coverage amount was, which I think is an interesting story.
Yeah, once the residents were displaced, we sort of put a pause on this building. We thought, okay, how bad could it be? How hard could this be to get it fixed? We do repairs all the time. Surely we can get it done in 60 days and get it back. Get these people back.
I remember thinking
actually, these residents wanted to come back.
They did.
They loved this place. They were attached to it. But then once the adjuster contacted me and he walked through it, he's like, yeah, this is going to be a process. And it took a few weeks to get his write-up. And I was like, this is not a good sign. And
no.
when we got it back, I mean, it was the repairs and initial response costs and everything added up to be over $480,000.
So about $500,000.
Yeah.
Clearly, yeah.
And that, I remember you and I talking, 100, maybe a little more to fix it up initially. And then it comes in, 5 times. We're like, oh my goodness. We were a little off, but at that point, the insurance company contacted us and said, well, here's, we're going to call it a total loss because your coverage isn't quite that much. And we're just going to go ahead and pay out the policy max. And it actually streamlined that part of it a little bit because there was no going back and forth trying to negotiate. It was just exceeded the maximum coverage, and we did get that going. So then we were able to get a contractor and start working with contractors to get it, started. And yeah, it was quite a shock how much all that was going to cost and how much work it really needed.
Yeah, I forgot about that because I think we did have this hope because our lease has a 60-day condemnation clause or something like that in there, where we have basically 60 days to restore a property. And so people were, like you mentioned, kind of on the sidelines waiting, especially maybe the units that weren't as badly impacted. But then it, like you mentioned, it took so long just to get the adjuster out and then the estimate to us that we just said, hey, look, we're returning, you know, you guys are out of your leases. Like we can't get this property restored in 60 days. So everyone kind of found other places to live. So yeah, about $500,000 of damage to the property. There's another piece I wanted to talk about within a rental dwelling policy. And a lot of people may not know this, but a lot of rental dwelling policies have a lost rents provision. So if you do have a disaster like we did, then the insurance not only will help or should pay for the restoration of it, but also lost rents. And we got a shock here because I do remember on 46th Street, the first fire we had, we got up to like 6 months of coverage. I do remember that we were able to use. And I think we just hit it basically, if I remember right. But this one was a little different. Talk about that and what we found out there.
Yeah, I think, it was shockingly disappointing.
Yeah.
We found out that we only had $900 coverage for lost rents total. And
Yeah.
at first I thought, well, that has to be per unit, right? I mean, at least. And no, it was just total for the building. So it was 4 units and it rented about $1,000 per unit.
Yeah.
So we were getting about almost $4,000 a month. We only had $900 coverage entirely. And yeah, we knew this was going to be, I think our contractor said it was going to be a 6-month restoration minimum.
Mm-hmm.
And luckily he hit that. But when you talk about the 2 months it took to kind of get it sorted out and then approved, it ended up being about 8 months of lost rents. And we had nowhere close to the coverage for that.
Right.
So yeah, our total losses definitely exceeded, $50,000 on that for that period. And so you add that to the damages. I mean, it was, over $500,000 total loss.
Sure. Yeah. And I don't know that we still have a great answer on that. I reached out to our insurance person and one of the people I contacted said it's typically the lost rents are about 10% of the overall dwelling coverage. So for example, if we had 400,000 on dwelling coverage, we would get about $40,000, up to $40,000 in lost rents. But that $900 number just felt random and like kind of a punch in the gut. Like seriously, it's like less than 1 month's rent on one unit. And this is what we get. It almost like was insulting to even receive in some ways. But so that's something to think about. And we're going to try to, I have reached out to our insurance company to get more clarity on that. And hopefully we can, if this happens again, we're going to have that coverage correct. But like you mentioned, go ahead. You were going to say something there.
Yeah, I think that, we did have a little more coverage with the our renters insurance. I think they had $4,000. I think it's $1,000 per unit. So that helped a little bit as well. But funny thing is that our insurance had a really nice demo add-on provision, which gave us an additional $20,000 there that went towards the damages. But that helped overall coverage a little bit. I think the thing that I remember about this whole process is that over the last, 5 years or so, insurance premiums have just been skyrocketing. And I don't think we purposely cut this coverage. I think it was just an oversight, but it isn't surprising that they cut back some coverages, and maybe, it's our own fault for not noticing this, obviously, but it is important to know all the details of your policy and make sure you have adequate coverage.
Yeah. So like you mentioned, it took, I think, close to 10 months or so, 8 to 10 months to get this property where I remember we did a final walkthrough of it, and literally I got like paint on my pants, if I remember, because they were trying to finish up so we could do a final walkthrough. But the property, was restored beautifully. It looked amazing, probably even better than before. But talk about that process, because there's a lot there. What were your takeaways of that whole restoration process, we'll call it?
Well, fortunately, we had a good contractor who took the reins of doing the work, and we had our property managers help out a little bit towards the end, doing
Yeah.
final punch outs and things like that. But overall, it was a lot of insurance coordinating because I think after our insurance got involved, I think there was at least three other parties involved with this. I think the neighbor's house had a little bit of damage. I had to talk to him a few times and help him with his claim. But you had four residents. They all had residence insurance and they lost personal effects. And then the occupant who caused the fire, I mean, the occupant didn't actually cause the fire. It was one of their guests, but our lease has provisions where she's responsible for her guest and they were responsible for the fire. And then their personal insurance got involved as well, which was sort of the saving grace for us at the end that made up that gap that we had for, especially for lost rents, basically.
Right. Yeah, it's crazy when you get involved in something like this with like multiple parties, just the amount of, not only want to say blame game, but it's just everyone's suing everybody else. And it's just, so in the end, you're right. I think it worked out pretty well, but it was a process. I mean, it's not something you go into, especially with fire damage and just paint and replace flooring and things like that. There's a lot of process involved because you got smell, you've got charred wood, you got to replace. There's just all kinds of things involved with it. So,
but then you got to pick out, all the colors and all the different materials you want to replace it with. It's sort of like, we flipped a lot of houses in our time and we've done that, of course, but, doing it 4 units at one moment and it's kind of a rush in a way, trying to get this going, it was a lot of work. A lot of texts like, hey, what do you want to do for paint? What do you want to do for tile? And I just had to sort all those details out. So
yeah, because there's like 4 rehabs really. I mean, I think we were pretty consistent through the units, but still, it's a lot of work. So let's talk, and we've talked about a little about this, but prevention, Scott. There are things, look, I mean, you can't prevent necessarily, a small kid from going to an attic and lighting matches or, even though our lease has provisions about smoking, we don't, people have free wills. So this person smoked on a deck and shouldn't have been doing that, and that caused the fire. But there are some things landlords can do from a prevention standpoint. Talk about your thoughts on prevention.
Yeah, you mentioned a couple things. I think, you want to have really good lease structure that prevents some of the more common things like smoking. So we prohibit smoking in all the properties. I think that's one of the main causes of house fires, unfortunately. Then, we do require our residents to have residence coverage insurance. So that helps as well. But I think from an investor standpoint, when you purchase a property, I think one of the very first things that you should do is make sure that the electrical and mechanical systems are up to code and in good shape. I think when we first started, we saw a lot of really hokey stuff. 25 years ago, I don't think the standards were nearly as strong. And we saw a lot of knob and tube still in housing long ago. In today's market, that's really rare to find that still in existence. And if you do come across that, you should have that updated. I think that's a big first step in your upfront capitalization, trying to make sure the property is brought up to a strong current standard and it's going to be safe before a resident moves in. I think besides that, I think just having ongoing maintenance and routine checks on certain mechanical systems like your furnace. We have an annual requirement that we want them checked at least annually. And then beyond that, going and making sure, as you mentioned, smoke detectors are required. And we do have provisions in our lease for residents to maintain those once they move in. But we don't always just absolutely trust that. And we have other programs that help. So we do annual inspections ourselves. And I think we test all smoke detectors and verify that. And then we also have an additional fire and safety annual visit that we can do that does more than just the smoke detectors. Because in Indiana, they don't require other things like fire extinguishers and carbon detectors, but we do recommend those, and that annual process will check those in addition to the smoke detectors. So I think just having the adequate fire safety equipment in the house will definitely reduce injury, and that's the whole point. If a fire happens, you just don't want someone getting hurt.
Yeah, you're right. Because like I mentioned at the top, we've been very lucky that way, I think, or fortunate, or,
Yeah, knock on wood.
but we do have good provisions in place. And, with this fire, it was no fault of the house, no fault. It just happened to be someone made a bad mistake and caused the fire. So, yeah. And again, you mentioned renter's insurance. It's such a valuable thing. We require it. I think all landlords should require it. It's not expensive. It helps the resident in case of like their belongings. I'm sure insurance policies, the renter's insurance policies for our property that burned were used to help replace some of their personal items. Because let's face it, a lot of personal items were damaged or destroyed in that fire just because of the water and smoke and fire itself. But that whole piece of liability, like these kitchen fires that we mentioned earlier, our owners will not have to pay for these because our residents have insurance that's going to pay for it. And you may say, well, the owner's insurance could have paid for it. Yeah, but that's a claim, right? And no one wants to have that against the property. So it's good if your resident can file the policy and not have to bother the owner with that. So yeah, a lot of good prevention stuff you mentioned there. So I guess as we wrap this up, what are your biggest takeaways from this entire process? Because we don't have it fully occupied yet. We're getting it reoccupied. People are starting to live there now, starting to get back to normal. So what are your biggest takeaways from this process?
Well, I think that you just mentioned the first thing is that having the renter's insurance really does help, because the big shock, I mean, after all this was done and we had the property restored, we went through an insurance renewal and our insurance canceled us.
Yeah.
And so we had to scramble and find an alternative carrier. And it just, I obviously don't want to go too dark on insurance companies. They're not my favorite group.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, it was disappointing that, we had one claim that was not our fault and it basically canceled us. And then unfortunately that did increase our risk rates for our next insurance. So we are paying even higher premiums now. But other than that, I think just making sure what policies you do have, just have, a good understanding of what it covers and what your limits are, making sure that the assessed values are correct and the coverage amounts are correct. And then those ancillary issues like lost rents and or other ancillary coverages, especially for certain perils that are like maybe specific to a geographic region, like we're not going to have, a flood like from a river or ocean in Indianapolis, but
no
other
hurricanes.
parts of the country, yeah, exactly. There are other parts of the country that may have that, so just make sure you have the adequate coverage that will cover the risks that you face in those areas. But in Indiana, we have tornadoes and hail, and those coverages have been seeing erosion. There's less coverage now for those things because of the claim rates and whatnot. But at the end of the day, make sure you have those coverages for the risks that you have.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think you're right. Making sure your coverages are aligned with the value and your lost rents are aligned with the actual rents you're collecting. And I think another big takeaway is just be prepared to be patient, which is not my strong suit, but these things don't move very as quick as we all want them to. Contractors don't work as quickly as I think I had to go over a couple of times and be like, hey guys, we need to go, and they responded to that fortunately, but it can be a waiting game and it can be painful. And, with this one, we're just every day it's vacant, we lose money. But again, as I mentioned, I think the property is as beautiful as ever and happy with the final iteration of what this property is for us. But it was kind of painful getting here. So,
yeah, like you said, a year later, we have a nice asset again. It's fully functioning. We actually have residents living there now. And so, but it took a year to get here. And patience is definitely the third thing. Maybe it's the first thing, but you just definitely have to have that patience and be willing to put in the effort to get it going and sort it out.
Yeah. All right. Well, Scott, thanks for coming on here. It's been fun. It's not fun talking about disasters, but I guess we made it as fun as possible. So appreciate you coming on.
All right. Thanks, Jeremy.
We'll be back in 2 weeks with another podcast. Until next time, thank you so much for listening, and please stay invested in your investment.